Chapter 8. One night Lee Cow and I stopped by Henpeck Ho's workshop and found him in tears, holding a cheap silver comb in his hands while he wailed. When he had recovered enough to speak, he asked us to hear his story, because he had no one else with whom to share joys or sorrow. Lee Cow made him drink some wine, and then we sat down to listen. "A few years ago I managed to please the ancestress in some way," said Henpeck Ho. "She graciously allowed me to take a concubine, but I had no money of my own. I could not aspire to a lady of quality, or even the maid of a lady of quality. So I chose a dancing girl from Hangchow. Her name was Bright Star, and she was very beautiful and very brave, and I loved her with all my heart. She did not love me, of course, because I am old and ugly and something of a worm, but I never forced myself on her, and I think that she was reasonably happy. I gave her this comb as a token of my love. As you can see, it is not a very good comb, but it was all I could afford, and she wore it in her hair to please me. I had never been in love before, and in my foolishness I thought that my joy would last forever. One night the ancestress entertained some officers from the fort, and among them was a young captain, whose family was so distinguished that it was common knowledge that the ancestress would choose him to wed Fainting Maid. For some reason the name of Bright Star was mentioned, and suddenly the captain was all attention. She was no common dancing girl, he said excitedly. Bright Star had become a living legend in Hangchow through her skill and courage in the sword dance. And the young captain, who was a very famous swordsman himself, said that he would give anything to meet such an opponent. Since no distinctions of rank are allowed in the sword dance, the ancestress ordered Bright Star to perform. When she opened an old wicker case and took out 2 swords, I could see that she kept her heart in those glittering blades. She allowed me to oil her body, and I marveled at the pride and happiness in her eyes, and my beautiful dancing girl walked out the door like a queen. Sword dancers wear only loincloths, of course, and I could not bear to see Bright Star displayed like a piece of meat for the soldiers to leer at. I did not attend the dance, but I did not have to. The wind drifted down from the mansion, and with it came a clash of steel blades that grew louder and louder and faster and faster. I heard cheering, and then I heard the audience roaring at the top of their lungs. The drums pounded like thunder, and when the sand clock ran out, the audience continued to cheer in delight and wonder for nearly 10 minutes. The judges refused to declare a winner. Only gods, they said, had the right to choose between gods, and the palm was cut in 2, and half was given to each contestant. That night I lay in my bed and listened to the sobs of a dancing girl. She had fallen in love with the young captain, but what was she to do? Her social status was so low that it would be quite impossible for a gentleman of his rank to take her as a secondary wife, and she would be forced to see him as the husband of my daughter, but never could she reach out and touch him. All night long she wept, and in the morning I made my way to the fort and had a long talk with a young captain who had not slept a wink, because whenever he closed his eyes he saw the face of Bright Star. When I returned that evening, I clasped a gold chain around the throat of a dancing girl, and on the end of it was a beautiful jade pendant that was the token of the captain's love. "Am I not a worm?" said Henpeck Ho. "I had so little pride that I would even play panderer for the woman I loved. All that mattered was her happiness, and I went about it quite methodically. I discovered that there were 2 brief periods when the corridor between the walls was unguarded. At sunset, when the guards went off duty, the men in the kennels waited for a few minutes to make sure that everyone was out before they released the dogs. And at sunrise, the guards waited for a few minutes before entering the corridor to make sure the dogs were safely locked up. There was a small door in the inner wall at the north end of the estate, and I stole the key and gave it to Bright Star. That evening at sunset I gave the signal that the corridor was clear, and the young captain scaled the outer wall and raced across, and Bright Star opened the door. At sunrise he was able to return to the fort in the same way. For nearly a month she lived in heaven. I lived in hell, of course, but that was scarcely important on the relative scale of things, said Henpecked Hoe. Then one evening I heard a terrible scream. I raced to the wall and found Bright Star frantically tugging at the door. She had just opened it, but somebody had approached and she had been forced to hide. And when she came back, she discovered that the door had been closed and locked, and that the key had been taken. I raced to the kennels to try to stop the men from releasing the dogs, but I was too late. The terrible baying pack raced down the corridor, and the young captain was able to kill a great many of them, but he could not kill them all. As Bright Star desperately tugged at the door, she was forced to listen to the death of her captain. She could not stand it. When I ran back, I discovered that my beautiful dancing girl had thrown herself into an old well beside the wall. It was no accident. They knew at the fort that the captain was slipping away at night, and everyone who had attended the sword dance had seen the light in his eyes. From the joy in the eyes of Bright Star, it was obvious that the captain had found a way to cross the corridor. But who could have been so cruel as to lock the door and take the key? It was the murder of 2 innocent young people. Henpecked Hoe began to weep again, and it was nearly a minute before he could continue. Bright Star may have wanted to die, but her fate was far worse, he sobbed. So great had been her desire to reach the young captain that even in death she must continue to try to get through the door in time. But of course she cannot do it. The following night I returned to the well that had claimed her life, and I discovered that my beautiful dancing girl had been trapped in a ghost dance. Now I fear that she must suffer the agonies of the damned throughout eternity. Lee Cow jumped to his feet and clapped his hands sharply together. Nonsense, he said. There has never been a ghost dance that couldn't be broken, and there never will be. Ho! Take us to the scene of the tragedy, and you and I and number 10 Ox will take care of the problem immediately. It was almost the 3rd watch, the hour of ghosts, when we walked through the garden in the moonlight. The breeze sighed sadly through the leaves, and a lonely dog barked in the distance, and an owl drifted down like a falling leaf across the face of the moon. When we reached the wall, I saw that the door had been removed and the hole had been bricked up. The old well was covered over, and the path was overgrown by weeds. Lee Cow turned to me. Ox, have you been taught how to see ghosts? He said quietly. I blushed bright red. Master Lee, I said humbly, in my village young people are not introduced to the world of the dead until they have become civilized enough to respect the living. The abbot thought that I might possibly be ready for instruction after the fall harvest. Don't worry about it, he said reassuringly. The world of the dead is immensely complicated, but seeing ghosts is simplicity itself. Take a look at the wall where the door used to be. Take a very close look, and keep looking until you see something strange. I stared until my eyeballs hurt. Master Lee, I see something that puzzles me, I said finally. That faint shadow above the rose bush cannot possibly be caused by branches or by clouds passing the face of the moon. Where does it come from? Excellent, he said. You are looking at a ghost shadow. Ox, listen carefully, because what I am about to say will sound silly, but it is not. Whenever you see a ghost shadow, you must realize that the dead are trying to show you something, and you must think of the shadow as being a soft, comfortable blanket that you would like to pull over you. It is quite easy. Calm your heartbeat and clear your mind of everything except a comfortable blanket. Now reach out with your mind and pull it toward you, and then up over your head. Gently, gently, gently. No, you're trying much too hard. It requires no effort at all. Think of the comfort and warmth. Gently, gently, gently. Good. Now, tell me what you see. Master Lee, the patch in the wall is gone, and the door is back in place, I whispered. It is standing open, and the well is uncovered, and the path is clear of weeds. And so it was. although it was like a picture with a hazy frame around it that flickered at the periphery of my vision. Faint in the distance, I heard the watchman rap 3 times with his wooden knocker, and the 3 of us sat upon the grass beside the path. Henpecked Hoe reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "Dear boy, you are about to see something very beautiful, and you will learn that there is beauty that can break the heart," he said quietly. The great river of stars was sparkling above us, like a diamond necklace clasped around the black velvet throat of the sky. The cassia trees sparkled with dew, and the high brick wall appeared to be painted with silver, and bamboos lifted like long fingers waved in a soft breeze as they pointed toward the moon. A flute began to play, but it was like no flute that I had ever heard before. The same few notes were repeated over and over, softly and sadly, but with subtle variations in pitch and tone that caused every note to flutter in the air like the petal of a flower. A strange, flickering light moved slowly through the trees. I caught my breath. A ghost was dancing towards us to the hypnotic rhythm of the flute. Bright Star was so lovely that my heart felt as though a hand were squeezing it, and I found it difficult to breathe. She wore a long white robe that was embroidered with blue flowers, and she was dancing down the path with indescribable grace and delicacy. Every gesture of her hands, every movement of her feet, every subtle swirl of her robe gave meaning to the word perfection. But her eyes were wide and desperate. Li Kao leaned over. "Look behind you," he whispered. The door was closing very slowly, but just slightly faster than the unchanging song of the flute, and now I realized that the music was a chain that bound a dancing girl. Her eyes were agonized as she watched the door swing slowly shut, and 2 ghost tears trickled down her cheeks like transparent pearls. "Faster," I prayed silently. "Beautiful girl, you must dance faster." But she could not. Bound to a rhythm that she could not break, she floated towards us like a cloud, feet barely touching the ground, whirling with exquisite grace and pathetic desire. Her arms and hands in long, flowing robe, forming patterns that were subtle as smoke, and even the fingers that reached toward the door were positioned in the pattern of the dance. She was too late. The door closed tight with a cruel, cold click of a lock. Bright Star stood motionless, and a wave of agony flowed over me like a harsh winter wind, and then she was gone, and the music was gone, and the well was covered, and the path was overgrown by weeds, and I was staring with wet eyes at a bricked-up patch in a wall. Every night she dances, and every night I pray that she will be able to get through the door to her captain. But she cannot dance faster than the music allows, Henpecked Hoe said quietly. Thus Bright Star must dance until time comes to an end. Li Kao was softly humming the flute song as he thought, and then he slapped a knee with a hand. "Oh, the chain of a ghost dance is woven from the victim's own desire. But that magnificent young woman is ruled by more than one desire," he said. "No power in life or in death can prevent her from honoring her art, and it is artistry that will free a dancing girl. Your job will be to steal 2 swords and a couple of drums, Ox. I'd do it myself if I could be 90 again, but it looks as though you can have the honor of chopping off your arms and legs." "Of doing what?" I asked in a tiny voice. "It is said that the challenge of the sword dance is stronger than death itself, and now is the time to prove it," said Master Li. I quivered in my sandals, and I saw myself trundling around upon a trolley with a begging bowl clutched in my 2 remaining fingers. "Alms for the poor, alms for a poor legless cripple." Every year there are well-meaning officials who attempt to ban the sword dance on the ground that it kills or maims hundreds, if not thousands. And though the dance will continue as long as the great Tang sits upon the throne, the Son of Heaven devotes an hour a day to practice with the swords, I suppose that I should explain a barbaric ritual that may someday become as obsolete as scapulomancy. There are 2 contestants, 2 drummers, and 3 judges. The drums set the pace, and once the dance begins, it is forbidden to break the rhythm in any way. The contestants are required to perform 6 mandatory maneuvers in sequence, each with an increasing level of difficulty, and all maneuvers are performed while leaping. Both feet must leave the ground, and require precise slashes with 2 swords over, under, and around the body, that are graded according to grace, accuracy, closeness of blades to the body, and elevation of leap. These mandatory maneuvers are very important because the judges must beware of mismatches, and if one of the contestants is clearly outclassed, they will refuse to allow the dance to continue. The contestants begin quite far apart and move closer with each maneuver, and at the completion of the 6 mandatory maneuvers, they are practically face to face. If the judges are satisfied, they signal for the drummers to sound the beat of the 7th level, and now the dance becomes art, and occasionally it becomes murder. 7th level maneuvers are free form, and the only requirement is that they must be of the highest difficulty. The dancers attempt to express their souls, and the fun lies in the fact that once a maneuver has been completed, the dancer is free to clip the hair from his opponent's head, if he can do so before his feet touch the ground. The opponent is free to parry and thrust, but only after his own maneuver has been completed, and only before his own feet touch the ground. A dancer who attempts a stroke while so much as a toe is touching the earth is immediately disqualified. Masters disdain such easy targets as the hair on the head, and attempt to barber their opponent's beard or mustache, if he wears such adornments, and the loss of noses and eyes and ears is considered to be an occupational hazard of no great importance. Of course, if a dancer panics and breaks the rhythm, he will probably be killed, because he will be leaping up when he should be coming down, and his opponent will aim for his hair and cut off his head. During the mandatory maneuvers, the drummers play together, but with the 7th level they split, one for each dancer, and it is said that a truly great drummer is the equivalent of a 3rd sword. Sample gymnasium conversation. I heard that Fan Yun has challenged you. Who's your drummer? Blind Mang. Blind Mang? Great Buddha. I must sell my wife and wager the proceeds. Orderly, be so kind as to order flowers for Fang Yung's widow. Of course, that is at the master level, and the enemy of the raw amateur, such as number 10 Ox, is not his opponent, but he himself. The swords are as sharp as razors, and a terrific force is required to whip them around the body in a 7th level maneuver, and the amateur is likely to beam with pride after a successful maneuver, only to discover that he has left one of his legs lying upon the ground. It is quite impossible to describe the beauty of the sword dance in words. It is skill and pride and courage and grace and beauty rolled into one, and when 2 consummate masters go at it, their bodies seem to float effortlessly into the air and hang suspended in space, and their swords are flashing blinding blurs, particularly at night, in the light of torches, and the clash of steel meeting steel is like the songs of gongs that thrill the heart as well as the ears. Each brilliant maneuver inspires a counter-maneuver even more brilliant, and the drummers drive their rhythms into the heart of their champions and force them past human limitations into the realm of the supernatural. The audience screams as a blade slips through, and blood spurts, but the dancers laugh out loud, and then the sand clock runs out, and the drums fall silent, and even the judges leap to their feet and cheer as the panting contestants drop their swords and embrace. One might assume that this dangerous sport requires the strength of a man, but speed and suppleness can counterbalance strength. It is said that among the 6 greatest dancers of all time there was one woman, and I insist that the figure must be revised. 2 of them were women, and I am in a position to prove it. That night Li Kao carried 2 sharp swords up the path toward the wall. They had to be sharp, because an expert would spot dull blades in a second. Henpecked Ho carried 2 drums, and I carried 2,000 pounds of sheer terror. My flesh was all goosebumps as I stripped to my loincloth, and my fingers were like icicles as I took the swords from Li Kao. They hid in the shrubbery, and I have never known time that passed so slowly, yet reached midnight with such appalling swiftness. The watchman's knocker rapped 3 times, and I turned to see the faint outlines of a ghost shadow upon the patch where the door had been. The shadow blanket slipped easily over my head, and the door stood open, and the well was uncovered, and the path was clear of weeds. I walked up the path to meet Bright Star. The flute began to play its haunting melody. A light moved toward me. The exquisite girl came dancing down the path, and again I caught my breath as I watched the agony of her perfection, as she honored her art, even while her heart was breaking. She did not see me. Henpecked Ho began pounding his drum, and at first I couldn't imagine what he was doing. He certainly wasn't sounding the challenge to the sword dance, but finally my pulse told me the answer. The gentle scholar was playing the song that he loved most on earth, and that he had learned during the love-sick, sleepless nights. The heartbeat of a dancing girl. He leaned over his drum and put his weight into it, and the insistent heartbeat thudded and thundered through the trees, and the first flaw in the dance of Bright Star was the faintly puzzled expression that began to appear in her eyes. Li Kao's drum rang out with the challenge to the sword dance, weaving in and out and over and around the steady beat of a heart, and in awareness a growing wonder began to shine in the eyes of the dancing girl. I stepped forward and raised my swords in the salute, and then I knew that the legend was true, and that the challenge to the dance is stronger than death itself, because her eyes began to sparkle, and as the challenge and the heartbeat pounded louder and louder, her hands lifted gracefully to the clasp of her throat, and her robe fell to the ground, and she danced toward me in her loincloth, with the jade pendant that her captain had given her hanging between her small firm breasts on a golden chain, and Henpecked Ho's silver comb in her hair. Then she saw me. She spread her hands wide, and 2 ghost swords suddenly sparkled in the moonlight. The heartbeat thudded even louder, and Li Kao began to pound the command for the mandatory maneuvers. A master would never consent to dance with an amateur. It would be murder. I plastered a silly smile on my face and pretended that I was making a joke of boring classroom exercises, and then I launched into the air with the tiger, the kingfisher, dragon's breath, the swan, the serpent, and night rain. Bright Star didn't suspect that I was doing the very best that I could. She laughed and promptly imitated me, even to the slight stumble that I made after dragon's breath. We were moving closer and closer together, and Henpecked Ho's drum joined Li Kao's as they thundered the command for 7th level maneuvers. I sent a fervent prayer to the august personage of Jade, and then I leaped off the ground with 8th Drake under the river bridge. The august personage of Jade must have heard me, because I managed to complete the 8 savage slashes around my body and between my legs without castrating myself. But when I saw Bright Star's response, I nearly fainted. She lifted effortlessly into the air and floated like a leaf as she slashed her swords around her body in ice falling from a mountain top, which is very nearly impossible, and still had time before her toes touched the ground to take a couple of playful swipes that would have neatly trimmed my eyebrows if her ghost sword had been real. I managed to complete stallion racing in the meadow, and Bright Star tripled the level of difficulty with storm clouds, but her eyes narrowed suspiciously when she saw that I had left myself wide open. It was now or never. I leaped into the air with widow's tears, and Bright Star turned pale with shock and horror. I was dancing backward, out of reach of her swords. The drums continued, and she almost lost her balance. My cowardice was plain to see, but the judges had not stopped the contest, and there could be only one explanation. They had been bribed, and the sword dance had been defiled, and her whole world was crashing down around her ears. "What? You break the rhythm of the dance?" I sneered. "Are you afraid of me, base-born dancing girl?" That did it. The beautiful ghost uttered a piercing scream of rage, and her lithe body shot up into the air, and her swords began to flicker around her body like tongues of flame as she pursued me down that path, performing several seventh-level maneuvers that I could not possibly believe, even though the blades were flashing right in front of my face. I puffed and panted and danced backward as fast as I could, but nothing on earth could persuade a dancer to continue if the opponent failed to complete a maneuver, and now I was slicing myself to ribbons. Henpecked Ho began to pound Bright Star's heartbeat so powerfully that blood was spurting from the palms of his hands, and Li Kao's drum was drowning out the ghost flute as it commanded, "Faster! Faster! Faster!" I glanced behind me. The door was already half closed, and I danced faster, but my lungs were filled with hot coals, and there were black spots before my eyes. Somehow I managed to complete eagle screams without leaving my severed feet upon the ground. Bright Star contemptuously countered with eagle screams above the lamb, which has been successfully performed no more than 5 times in the 2,000 years of the sword dance, and had time for 2 swipes that would have removed my ears, and a third that was intended to emasculate me. Her eyes were on fire, and her hair was standing up like the fur of a big, beautiful cat. The ghost swords were whipping around her leaping body with unbelievable force, and they slashed out to remove my eyes and my nose, and her toes barely touched the ground before she was airborne again. Now and then she comes to dance for me in my dreams. I do not believe that many men are so honored. Faster, the drums thundered. Faster, faster. I danced faster, and then my swords got all tangled up as I was attempting 10th dive of the blue heron, and I backed into a log upon the path and tripped and fell. The beautiful ghost leaped over me, and her swords flashed out to remove my hide from my nose to my toes, and she landed on the other side. The drums stopped instantly. Bright Star shook her head dazedly, and then her eyes widened with wonder and hope as she realized that the log that had tripped me had been placed directly in front of the door, and it was still partly open, and she had leaped right through the gap. Li Kao and Henpecked Ho came running up the path as the tall dancing girl slowly turned to her captain. He was a tall, handsome ghost, and in life he must have been very heroic, because he was able to turn from Bright Star and lift his clenched fist in the soldier's salute, and to hold it for the full 7 seconds before he swept away his dancing girl into his arms. Then the ghosts faded away, and the flute faded away, and the door faded away, and the cover returned to the well, and the weeds returned to the path, and we were looking at a bricked-up patch in a wall. The hands of Master Li and Henpecked Ho were dripping with blood, and I looked like something that the cat had dragged from a slaughterhouse. We made a rather bedraggled group for such solemn ceremonies, but we doubted that anyone would mind. At Henpecked Ho's workshop we cut paper silhouettes of the happy couple. We burned paper money for the dowry, and food for the guests, and we spilled wine upon the ground. Henpecked Ho spoke for the bride, and I spoke for the groom, and Li Kao chanted the wedding vows, and when the cock crowed, we thanked the newlyweds for the banquet, and let them go at last to the bridal bed. Thus Bright Star married her captain, and Henpecked Ho's gentle heart was finally at rest. "All in all," said Master Li as he helped me limp down the path, "it has been a rather satisfactory evening.